My name is Troy Jensen, and you're listening to Government Teacher Unplugged.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th,
Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. Without objection, order. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is on the vote and the motion of the gentleman from Illinois.
Welcome back to Government Teacher Unplugged. Today I want to get back to the basics and talk about the events after the Constitutional Convention. After the convention, the newly created Constitution was not immediately adopted. The individual states still had to ratify the Constitution. There is this common misconception about the ratification process, and I'm going to try to explain what really happened. All the states needed to ratify this U.S. Constitution. Now, what does ratify mean? This means that the states all needed to give a formal consent of approval. To do this, they would have to go back, the delegates would have to go back to their individual states, and they'd really have to kind of present the Constitution that was created during the Constitutional Convention and, get a vote in state legislatures to pass or deny the U.S. Constitution. Now, why is this whole ratification so important? Well, I like to talk about it because it's really when you see the creation of the first political parties. Okay, you have two opposing groups. You have the Federalists, who are for ratification of the U.S. Constitution, and you have the Anti-Federalist, who are against the ratification of the U.S. Constitution because they feel it gives the government too much power. So let's talk about, kind of what happened, and dive a little bit deeper into what was going on after the Constitutional Convention. After months of debate, and compromise at the Constitutional Convention, really 38 of the delegates signed the new Constitution of the United States. But the U.S. Constitution was not in force until it was really ratified. This means, this ratification that states had to agree to accept the U.S. Constitution. Article 7 required that 9 states out of the existing 13 states had to really ratify the Constitution before it could be adopted. Now, this 9 out of 13 number, I really suspect that it came from the Articles of Confederation. If you remember, to pass any major law in the Articles of Confederation, you needed to have 9 out of the 13 states agree. So we're taking this same idea of 9 out of 13 and really for adopting the U.S. Constitution or not. So a convention was held in each state at which, these delegates really debated the Constitution and voted for or against ratification. Some people welcomed the new Constitution. They were big in favor of it, mainly because they had seen the problems with the Articles of Confederation and heard of the rebellions that were going on. They were known, these people that were really pushing this idea, like we talked about a little bit earlier, these were your Federalists. But there was also a lot of people that were against it. And these were your Anti-Federalists. These were the ones that were really against the U.S. Constitution. So let's talk about the Anti-Federalists for a little bit. In New York, several essays were published attacking the new Constitution. These were called the Anti-Federalist essays. And really, they were written under a bunch of different names. The two most important names were Cato and Brutus. Now, I always thought it was funny that, the Anti-Federalists, the ones that were against the U.S. Constitution, they took the name of Brutus. Now, who is Brutus? What is Brutus? Brutus was one of Julius Caesar's most trusted allies, specifically, in the Roman Republic. Brutus also believed that Caesar had gained so much power that he had turned the Roman Republic into this idea of this dictatorship where Caesar was now the true king and he wasn't listening to the Republic. So Brutus stabs him in the back. So I always thought that was kind of a cool little play that the Anti-Federalists used the name of Brutus. These essays, they really were published all over through New York and to all of the different colonies. The Anti-Federalists, they took up these names because they didn't want people to really know who they were that were talking about it. You wouldn't want, a delegate from Massachusetts telling you how you should vote in the state of New York. You're not going to want that. So they took up different names so nobody really knew who it was. In these essays, they criticized the broad powers of the proposed government and, the removal of power from the individual states. States were worried that all power would then go to a central government, and it would be so much like Great Britain that it would cause another civil war. They criticized the lack of rights or guaranteed individual freedoms. Now, individual states had created, a Declaration of Rights. Like one of our earliest constitutions was from Massachusetts and Virginia. Specifically, even the Bill of Rights, they came from, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. But on a federal level, these rights were not given to, the citizens of the United States. They were not spread equally among the states. It was a state-by-state case. Okay? The authors of the essays really hoped to sway public opinion and the opinion of the delegates to, really the state conventions. This was the idea, is they really wanted to sway the American people so that they would, contact the representatives or appointees to, their individual districts or people that represented them and say, we're either for or we are against, signing this U.S. Constitution. On the Federalists, the Federalists had done the same thing. Specifically, three Federalists that were really, really important. John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. They both took up the power of the quill and, decided to mount a counterattack. They also used, they went under the pen name of Publius. Okay, this referred to Publius Valerius Publicola, a great defender of the ancient Roman Republic. So we're going back to those Roman ideologies again. In late 1787, Hamilton wrote the first of really a series of essays defending the Constitution in New York newspapers. The authors made sure, really to describe what the Constitution was and why we need necessary powers. Some of my favorite essays, some of my favorite Federalist papers was, definitely Fed 10 and Fed 51, where they really talk about the corruption of what factions could be. And what a faction is a group of individuals that have so much power that they actually sway public opinion. Now, do we have factions today? Yes. Political parties could be a faction. Interest groups could become a faction. And the idea behind what a faction is it's a group of individuals that become so powerful that they take control of public policy, thereby eliminating the rights of the minorities. So the minorities have no rights. And Madison in Fed 1051, he really talked about why factions can become evil and corrupt. The essays pointed out the weaknesses as well of the Articles of Confederation and made a case for a strong central government, why we need a strong central government. So Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even in the United States at the time, who wasn't even in America, he was serving as an ambassador for France. He later wrote a letter calling the Federalist Papers the best commentary on the principles of government, really that's ever been written. In 2 centuries since they were, published, the Federalist Papers have really become a valuable tool to really understanding the debates, the conversation of why specific clauses are in the U.S. Constitution, and really to understand why we have the type of government today. Supreme Court justices have really referred back to, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists when making decisions. They argue the original intent of the Founding Fathers. So we have the U.S. Constitution, which is really the keystone to, our federal government and the government of the United States. But in reality, what holds holds that keystone together, the two rocks on the other side, is really the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. Okay. And this was, these papers came out during this whole ratification process and after the Constitutional Convention. And they are so important to really understand pressure that was really going on for the individual legislatures to sign the newly drafted Constitution. So just some quick facts. Delaware was the first state to really ratify the new Constitution, and they did this in December of 1787. Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they also ratified the Constitution that month. Connecticut, Georgia, they ratified it later in 1788, but some powerful states, including Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, they really withheld support. And the idea with withholding support goes back to that notion is they wanted a declaration of rights, of individual rights. And the Federalists thought that such an explicit protection was unnecessary. They thought that individual rights should be guaranteed by the states. But the Anti-Federalists believed that individual rights should be guaranteed by the federal government because the federal government would be more powerful than the state in the U.S. Constitution, that it should give more rights or give a baseline of protections. Many citizens worried, really about the rights and, would not be protected unless the protections were in writing. Unless it was, in the U.S. Constitution, they were worried that they wouldn't have those protections. And we can see now that they were right. Okay? They were right. We see individual states today take away simple rights, life, liberty, and property, or the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the federal government has to step in to protect those rights, those individual rights. So those citizens had every right to be worried at that time. The Anti-Federalist papers played up the concerns, and they really pushed this notion. Eventually, some conventions ratified the Constitution on the condition that it be amended, as soon as possible by a Bill of Rights. The Federalists finally agreed to this notion. Massachusetts ratified the Constitution in a close vote in February 1788. Maryland then ratified, and South Carolina followed. On June 21st, 1787, New Hampshire then followed, became the 9th state to ratify the document, and the Constitution was finally in force. The two largest states, Virginia, where Madison was from, and New York, where Hamilton was from, ratified the Constitution by close margins in June and July. North Carolina, which had initially voted against ratification, ratified the Constitution in November of 1789. And the final state, Rhode Island, had held out. It held out for 3 years after the Constitutional Convention. It finally signed the U.S. Constitution. Now, fun fact about Rhode Island. They were against the U.S. Constitution, and the reason behind that is they felt like their rights were not going to be given to them. Okay? And the funniest thing about Rhode Island and why it took so long, it almost created a civil war in the United States. And it was really because of the beliefs of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. After North Carolina had finally signed in 1789, Rhode Island, which never sent a delegate even to the Constitutional Convention, and was really the last holdout because they had such a belief in the Articles of Confederation, and they opposed this idea of a strong central government. They had so many, I think it was 11 attempts to ratify this new Constitution, and the votes were so crazy at first. On one referendum or a piece of legislature, there was 237 votes for the U.S. Constitution and 2,945 against. The arguments were, and the disagreements between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were crazy in Rhode Island. to the fact that, like when a group of Rhode Island Federalists began planning an ox roast to really celebrate the document in 1788, an army of 100 angry men assembled to stop it. Okay, this event nearly started a civil war, to the point like where they were arguing and like they were battling because they thought that this was another government takeover. So really the debate on ratification and, the distinguishing beliefs of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, this is what really led to the creation of a two-party system. When you have two individual parties who have two individual beliefs. The Federalists believed in the U.S. Constitution, and they believed that it did not need really a Declaration of Rights or a Bill of Rights. And they finally settled to get the, Anti-Federalists on board. They had to reach across the aisle, per se, and really agree so they could ratify the new U.S. Constitution. Okay, but this was the creation of the new form of government and this this two-party system. The Anti-Federalists, think about it this way, they were mostly farmers. They were mostly rural in intent. They did not want government intervention. They wanted to be state controlled, whereas the Federalists wanted a national control, a national legislature, one that could vote down state laws. This, my friends, was the start of the two-party system, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and the ratification process. Thank you so much for listening today.